Imma Vitelli is an international correspondent for Vanity Fair, Italy. She joined Vanity Fair covering the 33-day Israeli war against Lebanon in the summer of 2006. Ever since, she has covered conflicts in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Somalia, Israel, and the Palestinian Territories, and many other countries. She covered the Arab Spring in Tunisia and in Egypt, and was one of the first foreign reporters to travel to Benghazi to tell the story of the beginning of the Libyan revolution. She has recently been reporting on the Syrian crisis and covered the terrorist attacks in Paris, France, and recent allegations of sexual violence committed by refugees in Cologne, Germany. She was born in Matera, Italy, and has a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University, New York. After spending 1 year in Cairo and 8 years in Beirut, she is currently based in Rome. Last semester's dialogue, A Foreign Correspondent's Secret, How to See the Desert in a Grain of Sand, with Imma Vitelli, gave many of us insight into the everyday lives of people in war-torn areas. At once sobering and attention-grabbing, it's important to hear the stories that are never really told in mainstream media. Thank you, Imma Vitelli, for joining us once again, and we look forward to your writing workshop, which will be held tomorrow at 4 p.m. in Via Sassetti. It's a fantastic opportunity for students to work closely with her on their journalism skills, as well as to learn more about the profession. Any students interested can sign up after the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm always very happy to be back. It's kind of refreshing to be with young people like you, because you have this tremendous journey ahead of you. And so I do hope to plant some seeds, and maybe in 10 years or in 20 years, you might remember a word or two that's tremendously ambitious that I'll tell you. But let's go back to the talk. Stories we tell. This talk is kind of different from all the others because it is at the same time a confession and a tribute. It is a confession of failure, and is a tribute to a dear friend of mine, Anthony Shadid, New York Times reporter, who died 4 years ago, exactly 4 years ago in Syria, in his never-ending quest to humanize the Arabs and the Muslims. He paid the ultimate price. He thought that paying the ultimate price was worth it. He thought that you need to take some risks if you really want to tell the story of people on the other side. And I've been thinking a lot about what Anthony used to tell me preparing for this workshop, because at the very beginning, I actually kind of failed myself, and then I learned in the process. It was a process, and it was a learning experience. I will take you back to the Middle East, and I will take you back to Lebanon and Iraq. I could tell you stories about Europe and Cologne and the refugee trail, and we could go to the Balkans right now and talk about all these thousands of people flocking to Europe, but that would not explain how we got here. And how we got here, we can only understand if we go back to the beginning. And this is a story that began when you were very little. This is a story that really began back in 2001 with 9/11, and then with the invasion of Afghanistan, and then 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. I will tell you a personal story and explain why it was a failure. The duty of every writer, of every reporter, is to try to humanize the other, to go beyond our cliches and stereotypes, to see what unites us rather than separates us. But I think we failed. I think we kind of peddled the line of the foreign policy makers. We were played by governments and by our own ambition. It's harsh, but that's the way I felt 10 years later. At the very beginning, I was this young reporter who landed in the Middle East, arrived in Cairo, knew very little of the people I was supposed to cover because, you know, that's the way you do it. This is the way it happens. You're young, You're running after the biggest story of your life because you know it is the biggest story of your life. We all knew that this story was going to be with us for the rest of our lives. You know, the US invading 2 countries, one after the other. It was going to haunt us for generations. What we couldn't grasp back then were the unintended consequences of these wars. But let me tell you how it all started. For me, it started by landing in Cairo, and you know, I want to just know about the Arabs. Who were these people? There were 19 hijackers who knocked down the towers and other places in America on 9/11, and people like me, hundreds of us, flocked to the Middle East to try to understand them, a little bit like a reporter could have landed in the 30s in Germany, you know, to understand the Nazis. But the problem was, they were not the Nazis. You know, our stereotypes, our cliches, told us of a people that were basically completely dominated by their own religion, Islam. And our job was to inquire about political Islam. There was this ideology that allowed these 19 hijackers to go to New York that day and knock down the towers. And so we arrived and we landed, and we were really immature, and we didn't know the language, and we didn't know the people, and we only talked to the people who spoke our own language. And everything was a cliche. Because we only interviewed the people that kind of spoke our language, you know, we didn't see reality. And our editors back home, they saw the Middle East as this enormous cliche. So the Middle East was about Islam, and was about the hijab, the headscarf, and it was about suicide bombers. It was about the Christians being killed and oppressed by Muslims. It was all these things. And this is the luggage that we carried, the way we landed, this is the way we landed. I started Arabic classes immediately how I landed, but I didn't have the resources, I didn't have the money. To be a journalist, you need someone who pays your bills. You need someone who pays for your interpreter. You need someone who pays for your driver. You need someone who pays the expenses. If you want to do serious reporting, you need the money. And if you're freelancing, and most of people working in the Middle East today are freelancers, the majority. Newspapers don't have the money. So the majority of the people who are telling us the stories of what's going on are people who don't have the resources to do their job. A little bit the way I was. So I started Arabic classes, eventually that saved me. But at the very beginning, I had to sell stories. And the stories that I could sell were the stories basically my editors were asking me. And what were those stories? I told you. Headscarf, you know. All the stories were reassuring because they allowed us to make us feel better. They allowed us to establish our superiority. They allowed us to be proud and say that whatever it was that was going on, it was kind of horrible. It was all a product of fanaticism. They hated us for our values. You might have heard this line, they hate us for our values. It's our civilization that they hate and they resent. Frankly, this is BS, but it took me some time to learn that. So at the very beginning, I started writing stories because this is what my editors wanted me, and I needed to make a living, and I didn't know any better, and I didn't have the cash to afford an interpreter. So they asked me about the hijab, and what I was discovering, in fact, that the headscarf was not this symbol of a backward people stuck in time. It was not really about Islam, it was about tradition. It was about culture. It was a bit more nuanced than that. But was there room to really explore? At a certain point, I realized that in Cairo, women were wearing the hijab because some of them thought it was fashionable. The students at UC in Cairo, American University in Cairo, they thought it was really fashionable. Or some women, the poor women, the wives of fellahin, the wives of peasants in the countryside, they were wearing the scarf because they couldn't afford to go to the hairdresser. And so they covered their hair. That was convenient. Some other people would do so because they were watching shows where there were these pop preachers, imams, very popular imams, and they were telling them that unless they wore the scarf, they would go to hell. Now, that was interesting, right? That was interesting. Why? Because these preachers actually were doing their bit, issuing their sermons on televisions paid by the Gulf. They were Saudis, Qataris, Kuwaitis, People in those countries were paying these guys to say on television to women to wear the scarf, otherwise they would go to hell. Now that's interesting because this is culture, right? But it's also culture, and it's also what a government is doing. And those governments who are telling women they'll go to hell are our allies, are people that actually are in bed with our politicians. This was a recurring theme. There was this divorce between the reality that we were called to observe and report on and the actual plot going on. I'll give you another example. Christians. I mentioned the story of the Christians. Every now and then, and this we're talking about 2003, 4, 5, 6. We're talking about the beginning of this. I want you to understand, this is very important. Christians. There will be stories about the Muslims killing, abusing Christians. For example, in the Delta, in Egypt. This was a recurring thing. And then we would go there whenever there was an accident or problem or a fire or a church was torched or a priest was shot out. We would go there and tell this story, and then we would come back, and this would reinforce the stereotype. These ugly Muslims, look what they're doing, and Christians. But the reality that we failed to grasp, and it took me a long time to actually understand, was this was the number one rule of the dictatorship. Conquer and rule. Divide and rule. You need to have people fighting each other, to have problems among themselves in order to be busy and forget about the dictatorship. This was what, for example, Mubarak was doing back in Egypt. Now, what the stories that we told were not about the fact that the dictatorship was using the Muslims to abuse the Christians for his own end. No, the stories that we told was that there were these Muslims, going on a rampage against the Christians. And it was a problem of Islam and with Islam. When in fact, it was a problem of the dictatorship. It was a problem steered by the dictatorship. So we were manipulated. We were part of this cycle where we were reporting stories that the dictators created for us to tell the West, look, you're already supporting this dictator. You have to keep supporting this dictator. But look what these fundamentalists are doing. This cycle that I'm describing went on and on and on. At a certain point, I wanted to write a story about the wife of a suicide bomber. We were so intrigued, by the suicide bombers, right? This is this morbid thing, Why do they do that? Did we ever wonder why did they do that? Did we ever try to understand their motivations? No, they were fanatics. Did we ever try to go beyond their hatred? No, they just hated us for our values. I remember at that time I was still a struggling freelancer. My Arabic was getting better though. I pitched the story of a family of a suicide bomber. I wanted to profile the wife of a suicide bomber. I wanted to try to understand how this woman felt and what she thought about her husband. She knew what her husband was. She knew that her husband was going to die. She had 3 children. How can it be possible that a woman accepts to marry and have the children of a man who eventually is going to die and blow himself up? That was interesting, right? That was my idea. My editor said no. My editor said that no. Why? Because he had a different problem, my editor. My editor had the problem of selling newspapers. my editor had the problem of putting headlines that would catch the attention of readers. So that was the problem. You needed the juice, and the juice was only delivered by morbid headlines, by the focus on our stereotypes, right? The critical thinking that every one of us should carry in a bag was not what was interested in him. He didn't sell newspapers. What he really wanted to know was morbid descriptions of the bomber. And this morbid description of the bomber was what allowed us to feel better about ourselves and to demonize the others. So I insisted. I was not going to give up there easily. And the way I insisted, I said, I found a way to play him around. I found a way to play with his own cliches. And I was like, so you're telling me that you're not interested in the story of a woman, and you're not in a woman who married a suicide bomber, and you're not interested in knowing what this woman might think of his husband right now, spending time with 72 virgins in the Rhine of rivers of milk and honey. Basically, I was using the cliche about a suicide bomber. They say that he goes to heaven where 72 virgins are awaiting them with rivers of milk and honey. So that cliche was what gave the break I was looking for. The editor said, yes, okay, go do the story. And that kind of allowed me to explore this family and try to put on a newspaper on 5 pages the story of a family that had to basically suffer the ultimate loss, the loss of the breadwinner of the family, and to understand why they were doing it. At that point, I was already having a sort of crisis in my job. But the ultimate crisis, because I was understanding the culture, because I was not only relying on people who spoke my language, who were not representative of the place, and because at that point I really felt that there was this enormous gap between the stories that we were telling. They might have been accurate, but they were so far off the plot. They really missed the picture. We weren't really telling what was going on. And I think I really started to tell what was going on when I finally had an understanding of the culture, a knowledge of the language, and a committed newspaper. To really properly do your job as a reporter and as a journalist, you need an unbiased mind, you need an editor who gets it, and you need a company who supports you financially. These 3 things are essential. The reason why we're not getting what's going on in the Middle East today is because most of the people out there have none. They're not mature enough to have an unbiased mind. Most of them are very young. They don't know the culture they're landed in. They don't have editors who get it, and they don't have the support of companies willing to pay the bills, because the bills, it can be expensive. So I did have my break, and I'm taking you back to 2006, exactly 10 years ago in Lebanon, because that was the moment that I went completely local, and I really understood and experienced firsthand what really was this dehumanization of Muslims I'm talking about tonight. You might remember Condoleezza, you're young, but Condoleezza Rice, you know who she is, right? Okay, Secretary of State. Back in 2006, Israelis invaded southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah had kidnapped 3 soldiers on the border, and Israelis had invaded the south of the country and bombed Beirut, and bombed for 33 days, and that was very unpleasant. Condoleezza Rice, I could never forget that. She said that those were the birth pangs of a new Middle East. The day Condoleezza Rice said that, the day after actually, I think her quote were on the front page of the newspapers the day there was a massacre in southern Lebanon, the massacre of Cana. And I remember there were 10 of us, only 10 of us. There were hundreds of people covering the war, but only 10 of us, 10, maybe 12, went there. Because as Anthony Shadid, my friend, would say, you need to take risks if you really want to be on the other end, on the other side. And many people, and that's a legitimate question, many people don't want to take that risk. Many people do not want to die under bombs, you know, but unless you do know how it feels, then you don't really understand. So there were about a dozen of us. The fateful day, Condoleezza Rice, day after Condoleezza Rice said that those were the birth pangs of the Middle East. And the Israelis had bombed a village, had bombed his house, where there were 50, there were two large families, you know, in the Middle East, in the Arab world, families are extended, you know. And they were hiding in a basement because they were afraid. And they bombed this house, and there was a 3-story building, and 56 people died, and half of them were children. And I got there with a friend of mine, with Anthony, and with a friend of mine who was an Iraqi reporter who used to work for The Guardian. And we just sat there and counted the bodies of children. And at a certain point, there was an aid worker. He came out with this little tiny baby who must have been 1.5 years, who had earth in his mouth and was dead. And so this aid worker was as traumatized as one can be when you're digging up bodies, and just showed this little baby. There were one camera, maybe 2 cameras, 2 television cameras, maybe one. Pictures, there were photographers. He showed this little tiny baby and he said, "This is the new Middle East." Until that point, 4 years later, I had landed in the Middle East. I'd never experienced what it really felt like to be an Arab. And that was my initiation. At that point, I had a magazine that was fully committed. I had the editors who got it. And I started to have an unbiased mind, meaning that I kind of had worked through every single cliché and stereotype that I was carrying in my bag. And I was trying to think. If you want to be a reporter or a writer, really, you need to think. Critical thinking is essential. This ability to question everything you're told. The ability of identifying the lies that your government tells you. And then, slowly but surely, to develop the ability to grasp the plot, the wider picture. This is so important. A lot of us failed. You see, the problem with cliches and stereotypes is that they're easy. They're really easy, right? You don't have to think, you don't have to study, you don't have to reflect, you don't have to do this jump, you don't have to immerse yourself into the other culture. And it's as old as human beings, you know. I mean, 17 years ago, it was the Jews who were demonized. And they ended up in Auschwitz. It's just in human psyche, fear of the different, of people who do not look like you. A couple of years ago, I went to Lalibela. Lalibela is this place in Ethiopia. They're Christians, okay? They're not Muslims in Lalibela. They call it the Jerusalem of Africa. It's very remote, out there in the mountains. It takes forever, and very white people get there. I went on a journey. I went on a long walk to a monastery, a remote monastery, and there were 2 white people, me and the photographer. We had our local guide, this Ethiopian guide, and all in a sudden, out of the bushes, there were two locals who saw us. The moment they saw us, they were terrified. They started running. They really started running. They were terrified. And then I asked the guy, it's like, what the hell was that? And he said, you know, they probably never saw white people. It was not about religion. It was just about seeing people that look different, and your gut reaction, your gut feeling is like, oh my God, and they run away. So this is who you are, who we are. And we have to accept it, we have to recognize it in order to go beyond. Because otherwise, we will project onto the others all our fears. And that would be terrible, because fears separate us. This picture that you're seeing on the screen was another powerful moment where I kind of grasped the plot immediately. There was such a perfect metaphor for all that was going on in the Middle East. You know, the problem with invading a country, the problem with bombing people, is that what allows this to happen is the fact that they're just numbers. They don't have the story. They don't have humanity, because you do not recognize that humanity. When you're relating to a number, you don't feel anything. And that was the recurring problem I encountered. And then everything became again crystal clear. I really could understand the unintended consequences of the invasion of Iraq. And if you wanted to understand what's happening in Syria and what's happening with the refugees and what's happening in Europe and what's happening in Paris, if you really want to understand all of this, you need to understand, and I need to take you back to Iraq. Because in Iraq, all of this really started. This is Kambuka. This is Kambuka, which was the largest military prison in the world. And it was so until 2009, when the US forces shut it down. I went there when they were shutting the place down. The Americans wanted the people to see, the world to see that they were closing it down. It was a symbol of the occupation, and they frankly were eager to get the hell out. Now, Kambuka was on the border with Kuwait. I got there on an helicopter from Basra, and so I saw it from above. I saw it the way you see it there. You know, you're arriving from above, and you are in the desert, and you're on the border between Iraq and Kuwait, and you see these prisoners who are praying towards east, Mecca, but actually towards the barbed wire. And up there, you can't see them. They were the machine guns, the Mi-5 and Mi-6, they were of US soldiers. It was quite a stunning scene, a scene that's been haunted, that really haunted me for a long time. The Americans invaded Iraq in 2003 as liberators, soon became occupiers. There was insurgency, there was opposition, you know. It became a civil war. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but it came to Iraq eventually. One of the things that has been underreported is that Saddam Hussein, before the Americans invaded, opened the prisons and the mental hospitals. So you had literally thousands and thousands of gangsters and thieves roaming the streets. And you had psychopaths also roaming the streets. And you had the collapse of government, collapse of authority, no authority. You have all these gangsters and thieves on the streets. You have no policemen. You had nothing. And these guys who are white and speak a different language, who have guns, who have come supporting one sect, the Shias, over the others. Kambuka became, early on, this place where the Americans would just arrest people, very often randomly, and no lawyers were involved, no questionings, no nothing really. People would be taken from their homes and taken to Kambuka. I went to Kambuka because the US, on a two-day embed, the US forces again wanted to show us, you know, that they were going to close it. And I went there with, I will never forget, I went there with two reporters, one with Time magazine and one with the AP. And it was an embed, right? So there was this General Quantock. And General Quantock told us that in 6 years, the US forces detained 100,000 Iraqis. That's a lot of people. That they eventually released 85,000. That they had in custody 15,000, and most likely only 5 out of 10 of those would have stayed in prison. They basically arrested anyone found at the wrong place at the wrong time. And the reporter with the AP and with Time magazine, they asked questions, you know, about how they were going to release them, technicalities. And then they went back home and they wrote their stories, and there were only the Americans in the story. The Iraqis were not there. And I remember, I was the only foreigner, the other two reporters were American. And I remember I asked Quanto, I asked the general, I was like, General, it was a tremendous price that the Iraqis paid, you know, you arrested like that, 100,000 people, and it's just, most of them innocent, you're releasing them, and what was it all about? And he said, innocence is like a rainbow. It has a lot of hues. So I went back to Baghdad, and at that point, I had a magazine that paid my bills and a committed editor and an unbiased mind. I went back to Baghdad and I'm like, I can't write a story about the legacy of Kambuka unless I have the Iraqis, because otherwise I'll have only the Americans, and this is a recurring problem. Newspapers, the media will tell you only what your governments want them to tell you. You know, this peddling, this reproduction, this never-ending reproduction of the line of the State Department, of my Farnesina, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it just became disgusting, frankly. There were just too many lies. So I went back. It's like, how can you tell the story of a place like this? For God's sake, look at this picture. How can you tell the story of this place and the legacy of this place, 100,000 people, if you don't have the Iraqis? So I went back to Baghdad, and I talked to my fixer. Fixer is the local hand that a foreign correspondent hires to do the reporting, to help with the reporting. I told him, I need Iraqis, I need detainees, I need people who stayed in Kambuka. I need to know the story of Kambuka. Please find them. And I stayed there a few days, and eventually, he came back with some guys that were, frankly, very interesting. And by the way, and this is about losing the plot and not understanding what's going on just because you do not see, you know, the other side. By the way, Baghdadi, the emir of ISIS, stayed in Kambuka. And what's happening today in Iraq and in Syria was a product of Kambuka. And I just grasped this sense back then in 2009, and then we really knew a couple of years later, like a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago. But I found these guys. I might want to show you. Maybe I'm able to show them to you. I found these guys, and I must have talked to like 10 or 12 of these people. They would come to the Hamra Hotel, and we would have long conversations. And they told me year after year the story of Kambuka. I interviewed the guy who told me he was there at the very beginning of Kambuka, and there was no real Kambuka. Kambuka was planted literally, tents, camps, after Abu Ghraib. You might remember Abu Ghraib, right? And he told me, you know, at the beginning, they came, they arrested me at nighttime. I was on the roof. I was sleeping on the roof with my sister and my mother. You know, in Iraq, it's really hot in the summer, and people do sleep on their roofs. And so these foreigners came arrived into my house, and they just put some plastic handcuffs on my hands, and then I was blindfolded and chained, and no one told me anything, and I didn't know. It was a mystery. This guy was Shia, was a policeman, okay? And then he eventually realized it was a revenge of a neighbor. The neighbor told the Americans that he was an insurgent. This happened a lot. Private vengeance, you know, vendettas, plain. And then I interviewed another guy. He was a Baptist. They arrested him. In 2003, he said, you know, in 2003, it was just like 25 Baptists like me, and there were sheep, and there was just barbed wire, and we would take a shower using a pump and just, you know, take a pee in the desert. And then he went back. He went back, and in 2008, Kambuka had become a school of jihad. There was the war going on in Iraq, in Baghdad, the civil war, and the same thing was happening in Kambuka, because what happened in Kambuka, Fadi, another person that I met told me the story, what was happening in Kambuka was just a mirror of what was happening out there. So when he arrived, he realized that at that point the prison had become huge. There were 3 square kilometers of camps, 32 camps, you know, 32 camps with about from 500 to 1,000 prisoners. And then this weird thing about every camp had a color. So there was the red color, the red camp. The red camp was the camp of the jihadists. And then there was the purple camp. It was the camp of the Alibabas, the thieves. And then there were the green camps. There were the camps of the harmless people. And of course, the harmless people were the majority, but the red camps, where the fanatics were, you know, they were a minority, but they were organized. And then I interviewed this guy, and he told me this amazing story. It was like, you know, I had no idea. I went to the Camp 20, and the Camp 20 was red, and I didn't know. But as soon as I got in, I was first interviewed by the Americans through an interpreter, and then I was interviewed by 10 masked men inside. It's like, 10 masked men, what happened there? It's like, they were ruling the camp. It's like, who were they? Well, they were ISIS. They were ISIS. At that time, it was called Islamic State in Iraq, and then it became ISIS, Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria. It's like, who were they? It's like, yeah, they were the Islamic State. They were the jihadists. They were Al-Qaeda. How do you want to call them? It's like, and they were questioning you. What do they want to know? They want to know whether I was a policeman or whether I had anything to do with the government. And why did they want to do that? Why did they want to know that from you? I said, well, because anyone who was naive enough to tell them that they were, you know, they had relatives in the government, or they were cops or lawyers, they were killed. What do you mean they were killed? Yeah, because, you know, they had, in each camp, they had 4 emirs. It's like, what do you mean? Yeah, 4 emirs. They had the emir in charge of the whole thing, and then the emir of the fatwas, the Islamic rulings, and then they had the emir of the arsenal. What do you mean the emir of the arsenal? Yeah, because they were taking barbed wires and making knives, and then they were using glass to extract the eyes. It's like, what do you mean? It's like, you have no idea. It's like, and this was going under, you know, the nose of the Americans. They had no idea. And he said, so what did you do? He said, I prayed like never in my life. That was the only way I could survive. And I said, what was going on? Well, they killed 3 guys because they didn't know. And they said, one of them said he was a lawyer, another one said he was a policeman, another one bragged about having a relative in government. They killed them. Yeah, there was, the 4th emir was the executioner. The Americans were finding bodies, you know, they were burying them in the prison underneath the sand. I said, how did you survive? And he said, by praying and doing exactly everything they wanted me to do. Like, what? Whoa, I did a lot of running, you know? We Iraqis don't run, we don't exercise, but they wanted me to run. And why did they want you to run? Whoa, because they told me that when we were out, we were all going to be part of this enormous jihad, and I needed to run and know how to run after an attack. And I paused, and I'm like, really? And I said, the Americans were giving these guys pencils and piece of papers. They were planning all of this, and I didn't see it. This is such a perfect metaphor for what happened in Iraq. You break a country, you unleash forces that were there, but you didn't predict they were there. You have an insurgency made out of a minority. You put them in a prison all together. In this prison, where there are thousands of people, the majority is dominated by this bloodthirsty minority, because this bloodthirsty minority is organized. Remember about the Alibabas and about the mental psychopaths, all the psychopaths and the prisoners that Saddam released from prison. And all of this, it was almost like a sociological experiment. You get all these guys in one place, they're very safe, they're super safe. The Americans are there, they're paying for their accommodation, for their food, and they recruit, and they organize, and they plan. I wrote this story back in 2009, and the end of the story that I wrote was a quote from a tribal leader from the Sunni Triangle, from Samarra. And again, talking about self-fulfilling prophecy, this guy is really bitter. Because at that point, the narrative that the US government was delivering and we were buying was that the invasion went wrong, that then there was something called the surge with all these soldiers that arrived, extra soldiers, you know, there was the brainchild of General Petraeus, you know, you flood the place with new soldiers, so-called surge, you ally yourself with the Sunnis, you stabilize the place, mission accomplished, we go home. This was the narrative when I visited Kambuka. Mission accomplished, we fixed the problem, Iraq is fine, the war is over, we go back home. And this shack in Samarra, and this was in 2009, actually told me, you see, the Americans are leaving. And the Americans are also releasing these guys. And they don't know, they don't see what's happening, but what's happening and it's going to be that they're going to be back with a vengeance. And I'm waiting for them because I know that this war will never end. A year and a half ago, Martin Chulov is a colleague with The Guardian, found a guy with ISIS, interviewed him. And this guy basically told him, added some layers to the story that I told you. He said that basically, Baghdadi was in Kambuka in 2004. Of course, back then we didn't know who Baghdadi was. In 2009, there was no Baghdadi, right? This guy told The Guardian that ISIS was really born in Kambuka. That when these guys were released one after the other, they shared their telephone numbers and their names, and they wrote them down on the elastic of their boxers, on their underwear. And so one after the other, as they were released, they reconvened, and then eventually they planned to expand. In other words, the Americans provided a shelter for these guys to plan and to recruit. And they did so in an environment where they had unjustly imprisoned at least 85,000 people. Now, if you're sleeping on the roof of your mother with your mother and your sister in the heat of Baghdad, and you have a shop, and the only reason why you're arrested is because your shop is next to a place where they found some rockets, and you go to prison for 2 years without a lawyer, and you don't know why you're in prison, and then you come out, and you don't have any money, and you're bankrupt. And these guys told you, this is the phone number that you have to call if you want a job. I probably would have called. I probably at that point would have been so pissed off that I would have made that call. Does it sound strange? I'm not sure. You see, I think the failure that I told you at the very beginning when I started talking is really the failure of making understandable the other. What we did, I think, what a lot of us did was instead to make it unscrutable so that we could feel better, so that we could make it easier to wage wars. Now it's almost a Pavlovian reflex. There is something in Paris, we bombed them. There is 5 reporters, 5 photographers killed in Raqqa, we bombed them. It's like bombing them is our ultimate answer. But that would create more and more unintended consequences that we fail to grasp and that will be haunted by for generations to come. Thank you. Yes. Any question?
I assume you have questions? Except when you're following me, that's good.
First of all, thank you a lot. You said that you said that the problem is dehumanization. What's the best way to combat that? Is it to continue to tell these stories and expose people to the culture? Is there some other solution that you see?
The solution, I mean, is just to ask yourself all the time, what does this mean? And to have the other in your story all the time. You just need to have the others. Anthony Shadid used to say that small stories, those little footnotes, you know, at the end of history are what really allow us to understand. And so I think just be aware of your cliches and stereotypes and make an effort to understand deeply what are the motivations that drive people's actions. People do not want to die. People do not hate because of a religion. There are visceral forces that we unleashed, and it's very hard to control them. And we need to be aware of the role we played, you know? Awareness, I think, requires a critical thinking. Critical thinking is very important. Wow. It was shock and awe. Any other questions?
If you said that no newspaper will take your story purely because on the basis that they can't sell the story, have you ever considered writing a book?
No, I said that at the beginning.
Yeah, that's what I thought. But now they must
I
surely
wrote a
listen.
book and I will write another one.
Yeah,
Yes.
but surely they must listen to your story because it's so powerful. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
What's the question? Will I write a book?
No, sorry. I was basically wondering if you will continue like writing books, and if people are eagerly taking your story now in comparison to at first.
One of the things that maybe I didn't stress it enough is my life basically changed back in 2006 when I had an unbiased mind. 4 years later, after 4 years of freelancing, I kind of learned the place, and there was sort of this baptism of fire. And I had a committed magazine who paid my bills, and I had an editor who got it. So these three things you need: an unbiased mind, an editor who gets it, and a company who pays your bills. These three things are essential, to do your job properly. Yes, I did write a book, and I want to write another one. I need to find the time to write another one.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming again. I'm so looking forward to all your dialogues. But
Thank
my
you.
question specifically pertains to a dialogue we had for this entire week. We've had 2 dialogues discussing about the human rights issues in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And we had an ICC lawyer and the president of a committee that's working on the human rights in Afghanistan. And a big point of that they were driving home yesterday and the day before was these human rights are being violated both from the American side and then from the Middle Eastern side, but there's like a lack of accountability especially from the American side due to logistical reasons. And they emphasize that that from the international community there needs to be pressure to have these people hold accountable for their dehumanizing acts. So in your opinion, what can we do, or what do you think needs to be done in order for, say, Americans, like even Americans in the Middle East, to be held accountable for such crimes like these? Like such like blatant disregard for basic human rights?
Political will to punish. But there is a lot of revisionism. I don't really see. I'm a pragmatist, and I believe in the importance of awareness and awakening, and of people being aware of what we do when we do things. In retrospect, do I believe that the Americans, that U.S. forces or Bush will all at a certain point pay for what they did? I don't think so. Do I think any of these dictators in these countries will ever pay? I don't think so. Dictators normally can die a violent death. That's the way they pay. Most of the time they survive, or they die violently, like Gaddafi, Saddam, all these guys. I'm a pessimist in terms of what they're doing at The Hague. I don't see that coming. I don't see the power of accountability coming. I just don't see it. I don't see the political will.
Thank you for this dialogue. My question is, when you first landed into a new country where you don't speak the local language, and how could you make your way into these interviews? How could you immerse into the local culture? Did you face some difficulties when you were doing these interviews?
As I tried to explain at the very beginning, because I was new and I didn't speak the language and I didn't know the culture and I was a complete stranger, I carried my cliches and stereotypes with me, and because I didn't have the money to afford an interpreter, I only spoke to the people who spoke English. And that kind of tilted my understanding of reality, of the reality that I was supposed to report on. Then slowly but surely, everything is a process. Slowly but surely, I started to understand the forces at play, and I studied Arabic, so my Arabic slowly but surely improved, very slowly but surely improved, and I started to know people, more people, and so all it took was time, patience, passion. You need the passion. You need this driving force, you know, this emotional reservoir inside of you that pushes you towards the other. You need to understand the other. Curiosity is very important. I was really at a certain point, when I got rid of my cliches and I knew where I was, more or less, I was still a Westerner, and everything, you know, was to be filtered. I was always asking, okay, this is what I'm seeing, but this really what I'm seeing is really what it is, or is this just a product of my imagination? Is this my projection? What is this? You know, I was always trying to filter. This is why I was telling you how a critical mind is important. And at that point, my friends became more and more, and they were coming from different facets of society, and that allowed me to have a firmer grasp of the reality I was investigating, I was exploring. Takes time, and patience, and passion, and curiosity. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, that's loud. Do you think if you had, let's say, a $5 device that translates any language to any other language, and your first experience, would you have been more able to like accept the culture? Or is it like strictly a language barrier, or is it just some sort of?
No, I think language is. Sorry, did I interrupt you?
No.
No, I think language is just one important part of a culture that escaped me. And so because it was like having a blank page. You land in a place and everything is white. You don't know where you are. And so you just project everything that is going on in your mind, everything that you read, the things that you read in newspapers, that you saw on television, that people told you, that you carry psychologically with you. And so you just massively project everything. And then if you live in the West, a lot of it has to do with the demonization of Islam. Everything has to do with Islam. And then you get there, and slowly but surely you realize that actually it's a problem of modernity. It's not about the religion, it's about modernity. And then you start asking questions about, okay, what this is all about then, why they're stuck in time, why they were not able to progress. And the moment you start asking yourself those questions, you realize the role that the West and colonialism had in all of this, you know, and then you go back and back. But you need to have an inquiring mind. I don't think a gadget would have done it, unfortunately. Yes.
I had a question concerning absolute monarchy in the Middle East, and I guess continuing the topic of dictatorship. I know I don't understand why or how we can completely vilify an entire country like Iran with democratically elected government while simultaneously ignoring the just despicable human rights violations done by countries like Saudi Arabia and just the complete lack of equal coverage. So I guess that's sort of the topic I'm trying to ask the question on. Like, how has the media come to a state where we allow that misrepresentation to happen, and how are we going to change or like reform the way the media works in the future where we can get fair coverage of all issues?
It's one of the, I try to focus on, I try to mention en passant the lethal effect, the really bad effect that the foreign policy of our own governments have on our perceptions. And so with Iran, you know, after what happened in Tehran back in 1979 with the hostage crisis, everything went to hell after that, I think, in terms of the US-Iranian relations. It didn't help the fact that the Ayatollahs made it back then very hard for us to get a visa. And so if you don't get a visa, you can't really tell the story of a place if you just are not allowed inside. And mind you, this demonization that you're talking about was twofold. It was done by the West, but it was also done by the Iranians, because eventually when I did get the visa, you know, it was not exactly easy to work there. I mean, I was followed, they decided who I could talk to and where I could go to and all of that. So it's always more complicated. And then of course the same thing was true for Saudi Arabia. I think what made a difference in terms of our coverage, we never wrote stories about the crystal clear, wonderful record in terms of human rights of Saudi Arabia, frankly. Our failure, the failure that I mentioned at the beginning, was exactly that. Even when we did kind of write scorching stories, that didn't change anything, you know, because they were higher interest at stake. Now, interestingly enough, now that the price of oil is so low, interesting enough, you know, with the peace process and the sanctions being lifted, things are changing. But Iran also contributed to this. There are a lot of stories now coming out of Iran because after Rouhani took power, became president, it's easier to get a visa. So they're opening up. You know, it's always more complicated. And yes, very often the coverage follows this narrative that reflects the foreign policy of a place, and this is the problem. Yes.
Hi, so my question comes in two parts. The first part is, so you talked a lot about events that happened in the early 2000s, and it's been quite a lot of time. So do you think the media has gotten better at humanizing the subjects? No? Okay, and my second part is, in what ways has the Syrian refugee crisis kind of irritated the situation? And if you could talk a little bit about media representation of Syrian refugees.
Are you coming to my class tomorrow?
I hope so.
Because no, because one of the things I wanted to talk about, and I wasn't sure tonight whether I wanted to take you back to Kambuka, but then I decided yes, it was totally worth it, or whether I was going to talk about Cologne, what happened in Cologne on New Year's Eve, and the refugees and all of that. No, we haven't gotten any better. Demonization is still there. Everything is very emotional. Everything is heavily politicized and manipulated. It's pretty horrible what's going on. And actually, I think it will become worse and worse because the pressure is tremendous. And basically, we opened up the door, you know, indiscriminately, but you can't do that. You can't just open up the door. You need some discernment. You need some discrimination. You need to kind of realize who you're taking in and who you're not taking in. And this is one of the tangled issues that people on the right end of the political spectrum are using. We are not doing a good job. No, I'm appalled. I'm really appalled. This is why I'm talking about failure. It's terrible. Tomorrow morning, if you're coming, I'll tell you about Cologne. Okay. All right? There is a girl.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I just want to say I love your talk so much. I literally could listen to you talk all day.
Thank you so much.
My question is, in your line of work as a journalist, have you ever felt, you know, kind of like you ever felt like backing out because of all of the mortifying situations you've been through, and or have your experiences kind of turned into like self-motivation and kind of like passion to carry on and really like prove a point?
Yes and no. I mean, for a long time, the things that the very horrible thing, the horrible things that I experienced powered my passion and my writing, and it became a sort of duty to humanize the dehumanized. I felt it that way. It was a sort of a mission. Nowadays, I'm in a crisis because it's never ending, and the emotional toll is very high, and I have to think about it. It's just a lot. It's just a lot. I got post-traumatic stress disorder, and then I'm a Westerner, I have money, I went to a shrink, but a lot of people that were with me, or they are under bombardment, they can't afford this luxury. And so there is guilt in that. I do feel guilty. It's like I'm quitting. But I'm in a crisis, and I don't know for how long I'll keep doing this.
Maybe we should leave it there. I was going to ask you, you made reference to the foreign ministries and the State Department and hand-feeding stories to the media. I suspect that's pretty predictable.
Yeah.
We all know that they're doing that, and maybe know the reasons why. So then it falls back to the media.
Absolutely.
And the question, why do they continue to
Absolutely.
eat what has been fed to them, as opposed to reporting more fundamentally, more critically, as you said?
Because some of them because they like it. They like what the government is feeding them. It's kind of palatable, to identify with this view. I can give you an example that I think is handy. I'm on a mailing list. I went to a university that Eileen doesn't like, but anyway, I went. No, just I went to the other University of New York. So we are all on this mailing list. So we are all on this mailing list, all the alumni, and we talk to each other. And there was someone saying something about Kabul or going out of Kabul and reporting outside of Kabul in Afghanistan. And then this guy was a classmate who went to J school, journalism school, but then ended up at State Department. This guy sent an email to the whole group saying how, but in a very friendly way, how it was a very bad idea to leave Kabul, and you really should stick to Kabul. Now, Kabul is where the US forces and the ISAF, the NATO headquarters, are in Kabul. Kabul is the official side of the Afghani story, okay? So this guy on a mailing list of journalists was recommending us, reporters on the ground, not to leave Kabul. I'm the only Italian. No, there are a few more Mohicans on the list, but I found it kind of strange that I was the only one on the list who actually, I waited for a day, no one replied, and then I'm like, I'm sorry, Mark, but you're not one of us, You're not a journalist, you're on the other side. And then there was this backlash from these Americans. I was like, they were against me. They were not. They were siding with the guy giving advice. So I think what's at stake here is that you want to play it safe. You don't know what's going on. To find out what's going on, you have to invest resources, not just financial. It's a lot of investing, and so we get it wrong.
And that goes back to the burnout question. It's hard.
Yeah, it's hard to get it right. It's hard. Yeah.
So, on behalf of the students, thank you for your candor and for your usual wonderful insight. And we'll see you again. But some of you will see them tomorrow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.